He won the Heisman Trophy in one of the most dominant seasons college football had ever seen. Not a close vote, not a debate, a landslide. Troy Smith was the best player in the country, the unquestioned leader of a powerhouse program, and the quarterback of a national title contender. And yet, the moment he entered the NFL pipeline, something changed. The conversation wasn't about reads or leadership, it wasn't about efficiency or wins, it was about height, about arm strength, about whether he was really a quarterback at all. Suddenly, the most decorated player in college football wasn't being evaluated like other quarterbacks with far less production. He was being reclassified, reframed, reduced. This is a story the league has told before. One where black quarterbacks are praised for athleticism, then quietly pressured to become something else. One where winning doesn't guarantee trust, and excellence doesn't guarantee patience. Troy Smith followed every rule the system said mattered, and still the system hesitated. In 2010, history was made in San Francisco, a milestone that should have been celebrated, protected, and built upon. Instead, it came with a short leash and an even shorter memory. This isn't a what if story, it's a why story. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. If you care about forgotten Black NFL history, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Old School Sundays. These stories don't stay buried unless we let them. The resume was supposed to end the conversation. Troy Smith didn't just win the Heisman Trophy, he dominated the vote in a way few players ever have. Over 91% of the first place ballots, one of the largest margins in the history of the award. A unanimous All-American, Team MVP, Davey O'Brien Award winner, 3 straight wins over Michigan, elite efficiency numbers year after year. Leadership that never wavered. This was not a borderline case, this was as clean a quarterback profile as college football could produce. But when the NFL evaluation process began, the conversation shifted almost immediately. The language changed, the standards changed. What had been called command became system. What had been called poise became limitations. One national championship loss against an NFL-loaded Florida defense was treated not as a bad night, but as a verdict. That single game began to outweigh an entire body of work. Height became a recurring concern, arm strength became a fixation. Mobility, once celebrated, was quietly reframed as a reason to doubt his ability to operate from the pocket, despite years of evidence that he already had. Other quarterbacks with uneven college careers were described as projects, players who needed time, patience, refinement. Troy Smith was evaluated as if there was nothing left to uncover. That contrast mattered. Quarterbacks with worse efficiency, fewer wins, and less responsibility were still discussed in terms of upside. Troy wasn't. His evaluation didn't ask what he could become, it asked whether what he already was would be enough. And when the league decided it wasn't, the fall was swift. By draft weekend, the Heisman Trophy no longer functioned as protection. It became an anomaly teams tried to explain away. Pick after pick passed. By the time his name was finally called in the 5th round, the message was unmistakable. His dominance had been acknowledged, but not trusted. The NFL didn't reject Troy Smith outright, they did something more revealing. They questioned whether his excellence counted the same way it did for others. Old School Sundays has partnered with Fanatics to bring you official NFL playoff gear at discounted prices. Hoodies, hats, jerseys, every team still standing. Support the channel and rep your squad the right way. The link is in the pinned bio. Once the discounts are gone, they're gone. The label followed him everywhere, not quarterback, athlete. A word that sounded flexible on the surface, but came with a very specific meaning inside NFL buildings. It meant packages instead of plans. It meant situational snaps instead of ownership of the offense. It meant proving you belonged every single week, while others were allowed to simply develop. In Baltimore, the usage told the story. Short yardage runs, gadget looks, 2 quarterback formations that put him in motion, out wide or back in the backfield. The message was subtle but consistent. His legs were trusted, his arm tolerated, and his command was never fully handed the keys. Even when fans called for him to start, the response was caution, as if protecting the offense meant protecting it from him. This wasn't framed as disrespect, it was framed as creativity, as innovation, as getting the most out of his skill set. But the effect was the same. He wasn't being groomed to lead an offense week after week. He was being slotted into roles that minimized risk, not for the defense, but for the organization. Other quarterbacks were allowed to struggle on Sundays and return on Mondays as starters. He was asked to justify his presence on the field, snap by snap. Every rep felt like an audition, every mistake felt like confirmation. And every success was treated as situational, never foundational. Even illness changed the trajectory. When he was sidelined, the door didn't wait. The position moved on, and when he returned, the path back wasn't about reclaiming the job, it was about fitting wherever the depth chart allowed. Quarterback became something he did occasionally, not something the team was committed to. The most telling part wasn't that the teams explored using him differently, it was how quickly they stopped exploring him at all as a long term answer. By the time his career reached its next stop, the league had already decided what box he fit into. And it wasn't one reserved for quarterbacks given patience, margin for error, or real authority. That decision followed him to San Francisco. And in 2010, it would finally be tested in real time with real stakes. When the call came from San Francisco, it wasn't framed as redemption, it was framed as insurance. A midseason move, a depth chart adjustment. Quiet, almost procedural. But once the decision was made to start Troy Smith in London, something happened that should have echoed through the league. For the first time in franchise history, the 49ers named a black quarterback as their starter. No ceremony, no headlines, no moment of reflection for one of the NFL's most storied organizations. Just a lineup card and a kickoff time. Against Denver, the performance didn't arrive all at once. The first half was uneven, conservative, careful. The kind of start that usually earns quarterback patience or at least time to adjust. But in the second half, the game flipped. Smith opened the offense. He attacked downfield. He ran when space appeared. He led 3 fourth-quarter touchdown drives, threw for a score, ran for another, and closed the door on a game that had been drifting. The win wasn't symbolic. It was functional, efficient, necessary. A week later, against St. Louis, the test got louder. Another Heisman winner across the field. A younger quarterback the league had already committed to. Smith didn't flinch. He threw for 356 yards, no interceptions, no giveaways. He led the offense through overtime and walked off with another win. 2 starts, 2 victories, a team that suddenly looked steadier at the most unstable position in football. On paper, this was the moment. The kind that earns quarterbacks patience, the kind that resets careers, the kind that forces organizations to pause and recalibrate. But the reaction never came. There was no public embrace, no declaration of direction, no sense that the position had just been solved. Instead, the tone stayed cautious, temporary, as if what was happening on the field was being treated as an exception rather than evidence. History had been made and immediately minimized, because while the wins counted in the standings, they didn't seem to count in the evaluation, and that difference would show itself quickly. The leash didn't loosen, it tightened. The wins bought him time on the schedule, but not in the building. San Francisco named him the starter for the next stretch, and on the surface, it looked like validation. Inside, it felt conditional. Every throw was measured, every series was evaluated as if the decision had already been made somewhere else. The team went 3-2 with him starting, not perfect, but steady, competitive, functional in a season that hadn't offered much of either. The offense moved with more urgency, the huddle had clarity, the mistakes that did happen were the kind quarterbacks are usually allowed to survive. Usually. But the standard was never softened. There was no talk of momentum, no framing of growth, losses were magnified, wins were explained away. The language stayed careful, almost rehearsed, as if success had to be contextualized before it could be accepted. And then, just as quietly as the opportunity arrived, it disappeared. He was replaced, not after a collapse, not after turnovers piled up, not after the team unraveled. He was replaced because the organization returned to what felt familiar, to what had already been invested in, to what had already been decided was safer. This is where the difference becomes hard to ignore. Other quarterbacks are allowed to lose games and keep their jobs. They're allowed to reset, to struggle publicly, to be part of a long-term plan even when the results don't immediately show it. For Troy Smith, the plan always felt provisional, like borrowed time. Winning didn't erase doubt, it just delayed the conclusion. By season's end, the message was unmistakable. He had done enough to help, not enough to be kept. Free agency came and the phone stayed quiet. No competition offered, no bridge role proposed, no curiosity about whether what he'd shown could be built on. The opportunity closed the same way it opened, without explanation. And when the league moved on, it did so confidently, as if the answer had already been proven. But outside the NFL bubble, a different version of Troy Smith was still waiting to be seen. And the next stop would make the contrast impossible to ignore. Once the door closed, it didn't slam, it sealed. Not because he couldn't play, but because the league rarely reopens quarterback evaluations for black passers once doubt sets in. At that point, context stops mattering. Wins are framed as circumstance, losses become proof, and opportunities don't reappear, they relocate. What followed wasn't unique to him. It fit a pattern that already played out around the league. Black quarterbacks were expected to arrive fully formed, mistake free, and immediately elevating. Others were allowed to arrive incomplete, to grow publicly, to be protected by language like developmental, coachability, and long term upside. The difference wasn't performance, it was patience. When Troy Smith left San Francisco, the league didn't debate what he'd shown. It simply moved past it. No open competition, no quarterback room built around him. The assumption wasn't that he needed refinement, it was that he had already shown his ceiling. That assumption is powerful. It ends careers quietly. So the path shifted, not by choice, but by design. New leagues, new uniforms, new systems. And almost immediately, the role clarified. He wasn't an experiment, he wasn't a gadget. He wasn't an emergency option, he was trusted to run offenses, call protections, manage games, and lead huddles. The same responsibilities he'd handled before when belief wasn't withheld. That contrast matters because it exposes the real question this story keeps circling. Why are black quarterbacks so often asked to prove they belong, while others are allowed to become who they're supposed to be? Why does winning sometimes count less than expectation? And why does versatility become a liability instead of an asset? Troy Smith didn't disappear because he couldn't play quarterback. He disappeared because the league decided what kind of quarterback he was allowed to be and refused to revisit that decision once it was made. And that's the part that lingers. Because when history looks back at 2010, it won't just see a first that went uncelebrated. It will see a standard that never moved, and a quarterback who met it anyway without being rewarded for it. Troy Smith is often remembered as a Heisman winner who never stuck in the NFL. That's the easy version, the comfortable version, the one that doesn't require the league or its fans to ask harder questions. But when you follow the timeline honestly, that explanation doesn't hold up. He wasn't given years to grow, he wasn't handed a system and allowed to struggle inside it. He wasn't protected by draft status or organizational patience. He was evaluated quickly, labeled early, and measured against a standard that never seemed to adjust, even when he won. In San Francisco, he made history without fanfare. He stabilized an offense, he won games. And when the moment called for belief, the league chose familiarity instead. That choice didn't just affect one season, it shaped how his entire career would be remembered. This is why stories like Troy Smith's matter. Not because they're tragic, but because they're instructive. They show how narrow the margin has been for black quarterbacks, how often the excellence has to be immediate, undeniable, and still somehow temporary. Old School Sundays exists to revisit these moments honestly, to question the narratives we've been handed, and to make sure the history of black NFL athletes isn't reduced to shortcuts and punchlines. If this story made you pause, do three things: like the video, comment on who you think should have gotten more time, and subscribe to the channel. These stories don't resurface on their own, they resurface because someone refuses to let them disappear.